Hello people. Today I'm going to step back in time over 40 years ago to when I was a little boy. Times were very hard back then and there was very little money around. And the money that we did have was very well earned, believe me. Now my mother was one hell of a woman, I can tell you that much. She reared 14 of us in total, mostly on her own, as my father died very, very young with a brain tumour. That woman was out in the spud fields 6 days a week just to put food on the table. And I guess as little as we did have, we were very, very lucky because there was a lot of people that had nothing at all. And thanks to that woman, we never ever went hungry. And we always had a big roaring fire on those massive Stanley stoves to keep us warm and cook our food on. Me, myself, let the truth be told, I was born in Wales, Newport, Wales. By the time I was just 3 years old, my real mother remarried and I was to be put into an orphanage over in Wales. But as soon as my grandmother here in South Tipperary heard about this, she said, "No way, Jose." And she jumped on that ferry from Rosslare to Fishguard, picked me up and brought me back here to Ireland. That woman was something else, I'll tell you that. As the years rolled on, my grandparents were only known to me as my mother and father, and all of my aunts and uncles were my brothers and sisters. The first time that I ever hit those spud fields, I was about 8 or 9 years of age. God, I remember those days like it was only yesterday. The method of spud picking back then was you pick the spuds from the ground into a huge 50 kg manure bag, and then you would empty that manure bag into giant wooden boxes, which I will get back to in a minute. First I will tell you how the spud fields were operated back then. When the spuds were ready for harvest, around September, October every year, the stalks of the spuds would flower. That meant they were ready for harvest. Then the stalks would be sprayed off. This was called burning them off. After 2 weeks, all you would see is a giant field full of drills and white stalks that look like huge straws covering the field. The spray that they used back in those days had no chemicals like today, let me tell you. The next thing, there was a machine used that was called a topper. It was a small little machine pulled along behind the back of a tractor. If those stalks were not burned off and topped, the next stage would have been impossible for another machine called the chain digger. So after being sprayed and topped, the drills of spuds were left with stalks that were about 2 inches in height. This would make it very light work for the chain digger. It was the only way to get spuds out of the ground back then, without ruining them. The next stage, the chain digger would come along, which had steel ramps that would dig down about a foot underneath those spud drills. Then boom, all you could see is a lovely flat drill of spuds sitting on top of that soil, 4 foot wide and a couple of 100 yards long, depending on the size of the field, of course. Next was the back-breaking part of the job, which was picking the spuds. You would pick the spuds into those 50 kg manure bags until they were full to the neck. Then you would lift that bag up onto your shoulder and walk to that wooden box and empty them in. At the start of each morning, everybody will get 1 box each, 1 empty box. And when they had filled that box, it would be brought off to a big trailer, emptied, and returned to you to fill it again. Now those wooden boxes, to me as a child at that age, were monsters. They were at least 5 foot square and 4.5 foot high from the ground. So you could imagine me as an 8 or 9-year-old trying to empty a bag of potatoes into those boxes. But I got around it. Now, like I said, those big boxes would hold a ton of spuds, which meant you had to fill at least 40 of those big 50 kg manure bags to fill the box to the top. Now it mightn't sound much, but 48 stone bags full to the neck was a lot of spud picking and back breaking. And you might have to do this 2 to 3 times a day, depending on how much money you wanted to earn. But when I started at about the age of 8 or 9, I couldn't see the top of the box, never mind reach it. So what I would do, I would use 2 buckets. I would fill one of the buckets with spuds and use the second bucket to stand up on so I could reach the top of that box. They were tough times, let me tell you. There was always between 40 to 50 grown men and women in the spud fields back then, every single day. all breaking their backs just to earn a hungry few bob. And if a fully grown man could fill 2 of those spud boxes every day, that was normally their limit. That was 2 spud boxes equals 80 bags of spuds. Now, without bragging or boasting, everybody in our little town knew that my mother was the best spud picker of the lot. She could outwork any man or woman any day of the week with her speed and stamina. And this was proved over many occasions, in days, weeks and months and years. That woman still picks spuds into her 60s, believe it or not. Tough as nails. And one day, everybody came up with a plan, as we were all from the same little town of Carrick, and we all knew each other very, very well. There was a huge man named Tommy Cook. He was a savage spud picker. The man had hands as big as shovels. So they decided to have a challenge between my mother and Tommy. Now, when the drills of spuds were dug out by the chain digger, they were about 4 feet wide, because the chain digger dug out 2 drills at a time. And it was very hard to pick 2 drills at a time on your own. So about 90% of the spud pickers back then would join up and they'd pick side by side, which meant they were only covering 2 feet of the drill instead of the full 4. The full 4 foot wide was very hard, let me tell you. But like I said, my mother and Tommy Cook were amongst only a handful of people who could pick the 2 drills together, 4 foot wide. So that day, everybody in the spud field gathered around. My mother stood at the start of 1 double drill, and Tommy Cook stood at the other side of a double drill. I remember that day as if it was just last week. And the amount of spuds on the drills that day, you could barely see the clay underneath them. They were so plentiful. When I think about it, I've picked spuds for more than 35 years. And I can genuinely say that day the spuds were the best crop of spuds that I'd ever seen in my life. They were great big giant golden wonders. The spuds were so good on that drill that you would be filling a bag to the top every 4 or 5 feet, which was phenomenal. But the idea of this race wasn't about how many bags of spuds you picked. It was about who got to the end of the drill the first. And those drills of spuds that day, I can still remember. They were almost 100 yards long. 4 foot wide, by 100 yards. That is savage. So the top man, the farmer that we were all working for, just left a roar. Go, he said. So my mother and Tommy bent down, opened the neck of them bags and started picking like lightning. Now, to be honest, I've total wicked big respect for Tommy Cook, as he was a neighbour of ours for many, many years in the same house and estate, a council estate. But the man had hands like shovels, and he would scoop everything in front of him into those bags. Spuds, clay, stones, whatever was on the drill. He was just a pure animal, serious spud picker. And my mother, on the other hand, was the cleanest spud picker. Now, I'm not just saying this, but she was the cleanest spud picker that anybody ever came across. As she would pick the spuds one at a time, one in each hand, but she was like lightning. And when that bag was full, there'd be absolutely nothing in that bag, only spuds. No dirt, no bits of stalks, no stones, just pure spuds. In fact, I remember the farmer saying to her many times, he said, "Biddy, them bags of spuds are so clean, they could nearly go straight to the shop. No need to bring them back to the yard to sort them out. They were that clean." So off they went up those two drills. Tommy was like a bulldozer. And my mother was like an overweight Bruce Lee. You couldn't even see the speed of her hands, she was so quick. Both were flat out, side by side, and the crowd was roaring. And the farmer that we worked for was also roaring, "Go on, Biddy, go on, Biddy. You have him, you have him." And finally, my mother met the top of that drill, almost 100 yards, stood up, barely out of breath, looked behind her, and Big Tommy was about 30 yards behind. So she had won. She had once again proved herself to be the best spud picker in the southeast of Ireland, and would always be remembered around our little town as that day went down in history with so many other days. I'm 99% sure that my mother was around 68, 69 when she stopped picking spuds. Now imagine women today, or men, going out doing one of the hardest jobs in history. I spoke to many people over the years, and the minute you mention picking spuds, they'd say, "No thanks, not for me." Because we all knew what it was like, absolute backbreaking for the hungry few pound that was involved. And as for me, by the time I was about 12 years of age, I was filling 2 of those boxes every single day. 2 ton of Spuds, 80 bags, at 12 years of age, which most grown men couldn't do. But I was reared into it by that woman, my mother. I love to look back on the good old times, when times meant something, not like today. We worked hard, we earned a few quid, we spent it wisely. In my next video, people, I'm going to tell you another true story about how our little town earned money every week before the spud picking, which wasn't as hard as a spud picking, but it was a very, very taunting job, and that was picking blackberries up in the woods, the fields and the mountains. That was savage. I know I haven't a great voice, I'm learning, I'll get there, but I hope you watched the best part of this video till the end, and I hope you'll join me on my next video. Thanks for watching. Kenny, over and out.